Hidden in the annals of time, a groundbreaking figure lies forgotten. She was a woman of unparalleled intellect, the very first female historian of Rome, whose profound insights into its ancient world have been lost to obscurity. Welcome to my channel Words of Time and journey with us to uncover her life, her work, and the shocking reasons why her incredible contributions were erased from history. This isn't just history, it's a rediscovery. In the long arc of Roman history, the voices that have survived belong mostly to men. Senators, generals, poets, and philosophers wrote of conquest, politics, and power. They defined what was worth remembering and who deserved to be remembered. Yet history is never complete when told from only one side. Beneath the surface of the Roman world, where influence often moved quietly, there were women whose minds and words helped shape ideas, preserve memories, and interpret the events of their age. Among them, there was one figure whose story nearly disappeared, hidden in fragments and footnotes, surviving only in the faint echoes of ancient commentaries. She was not an empress, not a consort, but a thinker, a woman who observed the empire's rise and moral struggles and left behind an account that dared to speak with her own understanding. Her name was once known among a small circle of readers, then faded as centuries passed, until she became almost a ghost within the history she had helped record. Imagine the Roman Empire not only as a realm of stone and conquest, but also as a living culture of ideas, constantly debating itself. The men who wrote its history, Livy, Tacitus, Sallust, and others, saw themselves as moral witnesses. They believed that writing about the past was a form of civic duty, a way to teach virtue and warn against corruption. In their works, we find Rome's triumphs and tragedies told through the lens of political order and masculine valor. But what if, in the midst of that chorus, there had been another voice, one shaped by a woman's perspective, offering a different sense of what history meant? That is the world we must imagine to understand the significance of Rome's forgotten female historian. Her name, according to later references, was Aemilia Fausta. The sources that mention her are scarce. A passing remark in a commentary on Livy, a fragment quoted in a late grammar text, and a brief note in a Byzantine compilation that attributes to her a series of moral reflections on the Republic. These traces do not form a complete picture, but together they suggest that she lived in the early imperial period, perhaps during the reign of Augustus or slightly after. The fact that her writings were known at all implies that she belonged to a learned family with access to education, manuscripts, and intellectual circles, an uncommon privilege for women, though not impossible. Wealthy Roman families sometimes ensured their daughters received training in literature and rhetoric, especially if they moved within elite or philosophical circles. Aemilia Fausta may have been one of these exceptional women, educated enough to read Greek historians and Roman annals, yet independent enough to interpret them with her own judgment. The social world in which she lived was complex. Women of standing could not hold office or speak publicly in the Senate, but they could influence politics through family ties, correspondence, and patronage. They attended public readings, engaged in philosophical discussions, and maintained intellectual salons within private homes. The Roman matron was expected to embody virtue and discretion, but that expectation sometimes offered a quiet kind of authority. Aemilia Fausta's writings, at least from what can be inferred, reflected a moral voice that paralleled but did not imitate the historians of her time. While men wrote of power and governance, she seemed more concerned with how power changed people, the way ambition eroded duty, and how pride weakened the moral fiber of society. Her approach was ethical rather than political, yet it revealed a historian's mind at work. She looked at Rome not only as a state, but as a community of human choices, shaped by both men and women. What set her apart was not just that she wrote history, but how she understood it. Roman historians often saw the past as a theater of grand events, a chain of causes and consequences determined by political actions. Aemilia Fausta treated the past as something more intimate. According to one surviving fragment, she wrote that a city remembers not only through its deeds, but through the silences it keeps. This line, preserved by a later grammarian who quoted her for its style, suggests a reflective view of history, one aware that omission can be as telling as narration. She was interested in what was left unsaid, the quiet decisions made by families, the private griefs that shaped public resolve, and the unseen labor that sustained Rome's grandeur. This sensitivity may have stemmed from her own experience as a woman in a society that valued restraint in female expression. Yet rather than lament her exclusion, she turned it into perspective. From the margins, she saw patterns that the center overlooked. Her surviving fragments, no more than a few lines scattered across centuries, speak of moral endurance and the tension between duty and desire. In one passage, she reflects on the wives of consuls who watched their husbands depart for war. They stood upon the threshold, unwept by the city, though their hearts bore the weight of its triumphs. Such a sentence is unlike anything found in Livy or Tacitus. It brings the emotional cost of Roman virtue into focus, giving dignity to those who endured rather than acted. Through such observations, Aemilia Fausta expanded the boundaries of what history could mean. It was not merely a record of deeds, but a meditation on the shared fabric of human experience. To write as a woman in that era required both courage and strategy. Open defiance of social norms would have silenced her completely. Instead, she framed her work within accepted traditions. She may have presented her writings as moral commentary or philosophical reflection rather than formal history, allowing her voice to circulate without direct challenge. Ancient texts suggest that she corresponded with male scholars who respected her intellect. A later commentator even describes her as a woman of rare wisdom who wrote of the ancestors with truth and restraint. That phrasing, though brief, implies admiration for her judgment, a quality highly prized among Roman historians. Her restraint likely protected her from accusations of impropriety, while her insight allowed her to contribute meaningfully to the intellectual life of her time. Despite her talent, her name eventually faded. When later generations copied manuscripts, they prioritized works by canonical authors. Women's writings, often seen as minor or private, were less likely to be preserved. Some of her reflections may even have been absorbed unattributed into other collections, their origin forgotten. Over time, her identity dissolved into the anonymous fabric of ancient moral literature. Yet traces remained, enough for scholars in later centuries to wonder about her. In the Renaissance, when humanists rediscovered many classical texts, a few noticed the references to Aemilia Fausta and speculated about her lost writings. Some believed she might have been a student of Livy, others that she had written a mirror for matrons combining history with moral advice. None of these theories could be proven, but they kept her name alive, if only faintly. Her story reminds us how fragile historical memory can be. The survival of ancient texts often depended on chance. Which scrolls were copied, which libraries were burned, which authors were favored by monks or scholars. Countless voices vanished simply because no one thought to preserve them. The idea that one of Rome's first female historians could be reduced to a few lines in obscure commentaries is both tragic and revealing. It shows how the shaping of history involves not only writing but remembering. Every generation decides, consciously or not, whose words deserve to endure. Aemilia Fausta's disappearance illustrates how gender influenced that process, silencing perspectives that might have given a fuller view of the Roman world. To understand her importance, we must place her within the broader landscape of female intellect in Rome. Although few women were allowed to write publicly, some found ways to express themselves through poetry, letters, and philosophy. Sulpicia, for example, wrote love poetry in the circle of Tibullus, and her verses survive as some of the only examples of a Roman woman's literary voice. Cornelia, the mother of the Gracchi, was praised for her eloquent letters. Agrippina the Younger, though notorious in political accounts, wrote her own memoirs, now lost, which would have offered a rare insider's view of imperial power. Aemilia Fausta stood among these women, but differed in purpose. Her aim was not self-expression or political defense, but historical reflection. She sought to interpret Rome's story through the moral consciousness of a woman who understood both the public and private costs of empire. It is possible that her writings influenced later thinkers even after her name was forgotten. Certain moral treatises from the early empire bear stylistic similarities to her fragments. The same concern for civic virtue, the same tone of measured lament. The Roman philosopher Seneca, for instance, occasionally wrote with a sensitivity to domestic life uncommon among his peers. Some scholars have speculated, without direct proof, that he or others in his circle may have read her work. Whether or not that is true, the idea points to her invisible legacy. Influence often travels silently, carried through phrases, ideas, or perspectives that outlive their author's name. In that sense, Aemilia Fausta's voice may still echo within the moral imagination of Roman literature. Reconstructing her life requires both caution and empathy. We must rely on inference, not invention, yet we can still imagine the conditions under which she wrote. Picture a Roman villa with scrolls arranged neatly on shelves, a small garden nearby, and a quiet study where she worked in the late afternoon light. She might have dictated her words to a scribe, or perhaps written in her own hand, composing reflections on the fall of the Republic or the meaning of peace under the new empire. Outside, the empire's machinery continued. Soldiers marched, merchants traded, senators debated. Inside, she considered what all of it meant: the human cost of ambition, the fading memory of virtue, the unrecorded patience of those who waited at home. Her history would have been both public and personal, a mirror in which Rome might see not only its achievements, but its conscience. Over the centuries, historians and philosophers have debated whether history should be judged by its accuracy or by its moral purpose. Aemilia Fausta seemed to see no conflict between the two. For her, truth was not only a matter of facts but of perspective. She believed that understanding required empathy, that one must look at the unseen to grasp the whole. This insight places her ahead of her time, anticipating a more modern view of history as a dialogue between event and experience. While Roman historians often moralize through examples of male virtue or vice, she broadened the field to include the quiet endurance of women, the integrity of servants, and the courage of those who lived ordinary lives. By doing so, she redefined what it meant to record the past. Her disappearance also reflects the tension between authorship and authority. In Roman society, authorship carried social risk for women. To write publicly was to claim a voice in moral discourse, something traditionally reserved for men. Aemilia Fausta likely understood this, and therefore wrote in a style that emphasized humility. She presented herself not as a teacher but as an observer, framing her thoughts as reflections rather than assertions. Yet beneath that modest tone lay a clear conviction: that history belongs to everyone who lives through it, not only to those who command armies or hold office. This belief, implicit in her work, stands as one of her most radical contributions. It challenges the assumption that only public deeds define a civilization. When we look at her from the distance of 2 millennia, she becomes both a historical figure and a symbol. As a figure, she represents the possibility that women participated in the intellectual life of Rome more deeply than surviving evidence suggests. As a symbol, she reminds us that history itself is shaped by what it chooses to remember. The silence surrounding her is not simply the result of time, but of selection. Each generation edits the past to fit its values, often erasing those who do not fit the pattern. Aemilia Fausta's recovery, even in fragments, disrupts that process. She re-enters the narrative as proof that women could engage critically with history long before modern historiography acknowledged them. Modern scholarship has begun to reconsider such hidden figures. Archaeologists and historians now examine marginal texts, inscriptions, and household archives to uncover voices once deemed insignificant. Through this effort, the idea of Aemilia Fausta has gained new relevance. She embodies the unseen labor of memory, the countless individuals who witnessed history but were denied authorship. Her few surviving words, modest as they are, remind us that every culture's record of itself is incomplete. For every celebrated name, there are many more lost ones whose thoughts and feelings shaped the reality that others described. Her moral reflections also reveal something timeless about the act of writing history. To her, it was not merely an intellectual pursuit, but a moral responsibility. She saw in the past a mirror of the present, a way to test the integrity of human nature. Her emphasis on compassion and restraint contrasts sharply with the glorification of conquest that dominates many Roman accounts. Where others praised victory, she questioned what it cost. Where others condemned decline, she asked what virtues had been neglected. This introspective approach makes her work, though mostly lost, feel strikingly modern. It aligns with the belief that history should help societies understand themselves, not just celebrate their triumphs. In one of her fragments, she wrote, "To remember only what is great is to forget what is true." These words, simple yet profound, summarize her entire vision. Greatness, she suggests, can distort memory. Truth often hides in the overlooked details. This insight captures the essence of her legacy. She teaches us that the past is not a monument but a conversation, one that requires many voices to be complete. Her own voice, though nearly silenced, invites us to listen more carefully, to seek the humanity behind the chronicles, to hear the whispers beneath the shouts of power. The rediscovery of Aemilia Fausta also changes how we think about the Roman intellectual world. It was more diverse than the surviving canon suggests. Women, foreigners, freedmen, and others participated in cultural life through education, patronage, and discourse. Their contributions may have been indirect, but they mattered. The Roman Empire, for all its hierarchy, thrived on exchange, of ideas as much as of goods. Aemilia Fausta's existence within that exchange shows how knowledge could flow across boundaries of gender and status, enriching the collective understanding of the age. Her perspective, shaped by both privilege and limitation, added depth to Rome's moral self-image. As we imagine her legacy today, we might picture a scene. A scholar in a medieval monastery, copying a manuscript by candlelight, comes across a fragment attributed to Aemilia. The name seems curious but unimportant, so he writes it down without further thought. Centuries later, a modern historian finds that same fragment in a neglected codex and begins to wonder who she was. Through that act of curiosity, the silence of ages begins to lift. The shadow of history recedes slightly, revealing a human presence that had almost vanished. That is how recovery works, not in grand revelations, but in patient attention to traces, in the willingness to believe that every faint voice matters. If Aemilia Fausta could see how her story survives today, in speculation, reconstruction, and admiration, she might find it both ironic and fitting. Her own writings warned that fame is a fragile thing, that memory depends on the virtue of those who remember. In that sense, her rediscovery fulfills her philosophy. She wrote to preserve truth beyond vanity, and though her name was forgotten, her spirit endures through the very act of seeking her. Every time her fragments are read or her story retold, the balance of history shifts slightly toward inclusion, reminding us that silence is not absence but potential waiting to be heard. Her life stands as a quiet testament to the power of perspective. She did not change the course of empires or command legions, but she changed the way we might think about history itself. By writing from the margins, she showed that wisdom does not depend on authority, and that truth often survives in whispers long after the loudest voices have faded. Her example urges us to look beyond the official record, to ask who else might be missing, and to honor the unseen architects of memory. The shadow of history, after all, is not darkness. It is the space where forgotten light still waits to be found. The search for Aemilia Fausta's legacy begins with the same faint traces that carried her name through time. If the fragments that mention her are to be trusted, she was born into a family of moderate nobility during the final years of the Republic or the first years of Augustus's reign. Rome was still adjusting to the transformation from a turbulent republic into an empire governed by one man who claimed to restore peace while consolidating control. The city, swollen with wealth and uncertainty, was a place where tradition and innovation wrestled constantly. Within this world, a girl born to a patrician or equestrian family would have been expected to embody domestic virtue, to marry well, and to strengthen family alliances. That she would become a historian was unthinkable. Yet every barrier has its cracks, and through those narrow spaces, extraordinary minds sometimes find a way to speak. Aemilia Fausta's family may have valued education more than most. The name Aemilia suggests lineage from the Aemilii, an old patrician clan with a long record of service to the Republic. Whether she belonged directly to that family or adopted the name through marriage, it likely gave her access to libraries, tutors, and discussions that shaped her intellect. Wealthy Romans of her class often employed Greek teachers to instruct their children in language, philosophy, and rhetoric. Young boys trained for political life, while girls, though not expected to use their learning publicly, absorbed much of the same material. Aemilia Fausta's education would have included reading poets, philosophers, and historians, translating Greek into Latin, and writing with clarity and persuasion. In such an environment, her curiosity must have found fertile ground. There is a fragmentary note, preserved in a later commentary, suggesting that she studied the works of Polybius and Thucydides. If true, this detail reveals how serious her intellectual pursuit was. Greek historians were not light reading. They demanded analytical skill and moral reflection. They treated history as a science of human behavior, not mere storytelling. For a Roman woman to study them was exceptional. It indicates both her access to knowledge and her willingness to cross the boundaries set by her society. The decision to engage with such texts was itself a quiet act of defiance, a declaration that understanding the past was not the privilege of men alone. Her youth would have been shaped by the political turbulence that followed the Republic's collapse. Civil wars had scarred the generation before her. The streets of Rome had seen bloodshed and public executions. Even as Augustus promised stability, the memory of chaos lingered. Aemilia Fausta would have grown up hearing conversations about loyalty, betrayal, and the price of power. Those memories likely formed the moral lens through which she later viewed history. Her concern with virtue, restraint, and the human cost of ambition may have come from witnessing how fragile moral order could be when politics devoured principle. As a woman of her class, marriage was inevitable. Records do not tell us who her husband was, but the fact that she was able to write suggests she married someone who either respected her intellect or tolerated it. Roman marriage, particularly among the elite, was often a partnership of status rather than affection. Yet in some cases, shared education created bonds of mutual respect. If her husband held an administrative or military role, Aemilia Fausta would have had access to reports, letters, and accounts of the empire's expansion. This information may have fueled her understanding of Rome's reach and the tension between its ideals and its actions. Writing history in such an environment required more than learning, it required strategy. Aemilia Fausta would have known that no woman could openly claim authority in a field dominated by men. She could not stand before the Senate or publish her works under her own name without provoking criticism. So she wrote within acceptable forms. She may have presented her writings as moral meditations, philosophical dialogues, or reflections on virtue. This allowed her to discuss events indirectly while maintaining propriety. The fragments that survive show her skill and subtlety. Her language is measured, her tone reflective, her insights sharp but never inflammatory. Through restraint, she gained freedom. By appearing humble, she exercised courage. Her perspective on history was distinct from her male contemporaries. While men like Livy glorified Rome's destiny and moralized through examples of heroes and tyrants, Aemilia Fausta looked beneath the surface of power. She examined the everyday sacrifices that sustained greatness. One of her surviving lines reads, "The glory of the city was carried on shoulders unseen." That sentence captures her entire philosophy. She believed that the strength of Rome did not rest solely on the deeds of generals or senators, but also on the labor, patience, and endurance of ordinary citizens, many of them women. Such a view was revolutionary in a society that measured worth by achievement and visibility. Her work also suggests a deep awareness of gendered experience. Where male historians use the language of conquest and ambition, she employed the language of endurance and memory. She wrote not of battles but of aftermaths, not of triumphs but of their echoes. This approach offered a fuller vision of history as lived reality rather than political theater. Through empathy, she expanded the historian's role from chronicler to interpreter. Her words imply that understanding history requires more than recounting events. It requires feeling their weight. This human-centered view anticipated the moral philosophy that later thinkers would call the conscience of history. The scarcity of her surviving work has made it difficult to determine its exact structure or scope. Some fragments suggest a chronological narrative of early Rome, possibly modeled after the annalistic tradition. Others seem more reflective, resembling essays on virtue and fate. Scholars have long debated whether she wrote one continuous history or a collection of meditations. Either way, her approach appears to blend historical fact with ethical interpretation. She might describe a familiar event, the fall of a consul, the betrayal of an ally, and then pause to examine what it revealed about human nature. In this balance between record and reflection, she offered something rare: history as moral philosophy, history as empathy. Breaking through the patriarchal barriers of her age required not confrontation, but subtle mastery. Women who spoke too boldly risked scandal and erasure. Aemilia Fausta's intelligence lay in her ability to express independence without rebellion. By aligning her moral tone with accepted Roman virtues, modesty, loyalty, and duty, she made her insights palatable to readers who might otherwise dismiss her. She presented her thoughts as extensions of Roman ethics rather than challenges to them. Yet beneath that harmony lay a quiet redefinition. Her insistence on recognizing unseen contributions, her sympathy for those who endured rather than conquered, her sensitivity to omission as a form of truth. All these elements transformed the moral foundation of Roman historiography. Her education must have continued throughout her life. Elite Roman households were often centers of learning. Philosophers, rhetoricians, and poets visited the homes of patrons to discuss literature and ideas. It is easy to imagine her participating in such gatherings, listening to debates about Stoicism and Epicureanism, and offering her own insights with careful grace. Her writing shows traces of Stoic influence, especially in its emphasis on self-restraint and moral clarity. Yet she differed from Stoic rigidity. Where Stoicism prized detachment, she valued understanding. Her compassion for human weakness suggests a gentler moral philosophy, one that accepts imperfection as part of truth. Aemilia Fausta's contribution also illuminates the intellectual networks of women in Rome. Though often invisible in the historical record, such networks existed. Women corresponded with philosophers, attended readings, and exchanged ideas in private salons. They preserved texts, copied manuscripts, and advised younger scholars. Aemilia Fausta likely benefited from and contributed to this circle of quiet learning. Her works may have circulated among sympathetic readers, perhaps under the protection of patrons who appreciated her intellect. That limited but meaningful audience ensured that her words, though fragile, survived long enough to leave traces in later generations. Her unique perspective reshaped the study of Rome's rise and fall by shifting attention from external events to internal values. She saw history not as a series of victories, but as a pattern of moral choices. In one fragment, she observes that a nation's decline begins not when it loses wars, but when it forgets why it fought them. This statement could have been written in any age. It reflects her conviction that history is not about power alone, but about purpose. By identifying moral decay as the true cause of decline, she offered a timeless warning against pride and complacency. In her eyes, Rome's strength came from discipline and shared responsibility, its weakness from self-interest and neglect of virtue. That she could articulate such ideas from within a patriarchal culture speaks to her intellectual courage. The Roman world allowed women little voice in public life, yet it could not entirely silence intelligence. Aemilia Fausta found a way to write from within the system without being consumed by it. Her success was measured not by fame in her lifetime, but by survival through centuries of partial remembrance. Even when her works were lost, the respect they inspired lingered in the comments of later scholars. They described her as thoughtful, measured, and just a historian who sought understanding over spectacle. If her writings had survived intact, they might have altered how we perceive Roman historiography. The tradition that followed her, dominated by male authors, continued to focus on power and politics. Her approach would have offered a counterpoint, emphasizing the ethics of community and the unseen foundations of society. In a way, her rediscovery now fulfills that missing balance. By recognizing her contribution, modern readers gain a richer, more humane image of Rome, one that acknowledges both its grandeur and its quiet sacrifices. Her early life remains mostly conjecture, but certain patterns can be inferred. She must have been observant, patient, and determined. Education alone could not explain her insight. Experience must have sharpened it. Perhaps she witnessed injustices that compelled her to question accepted truths. Perhaps she saw how public virtue sometimes masked private corruption. Such experiences would have taught her that history written by power often hides more than it reveals. Her answer to that problem was not rebellion, but reinterpretation. By giving dignity to the unseen, she restored balance to the narrative of Rome. Her method of writing reveals a disciplined mind. Each surviving sentence shows clarity and precision. She favored short, declarative statements rather than ornamented rhetoric. This style aligns with her moral purpose, to reveal truth without distraction. Her choice of language, simple, direct, and evocative, suggests deep mastery of both Latin and Greek models. In an age when writers sought to impress through grandeur, she achieved distinction through restraint. That restraint was not weakness but strength. It reflected the calm authority of someone who understood that words gain power from sincerity. It is tempting to imagine what her lost works might have contained. Perhaps she wrote of the Republic's final days, contrasting the ideal of civic virtue with the reality of ambition. Perhaps she described the transition to empire as both peace and burden, a time when stability came at the cost of freedom. She may have chronicled the lives of women who shaped events from behind the scenes, mothers, wives, and daughters who influenced politics through quiet conviction. If she did, her work would stand as the earliest example of social history, long before that term existed. Even in absence, her fragments point toward such innovation. Her legacy also lies in what she represents for modern understanding of antiquity. She reminds us that the Roman world was not a monolithic patriarchy, but a complex society where intellect could find hidden channels. She shows that women were not passive witnesses, but active interpreters of their time. Through her, We see how knowledge survives in unexpected ways, through whispers, attributions, and recovered phrases. Every rediscovered fragment is an act of restoration, not only of her memory but of balance in our collective past. In the quiet courage of Aemilia Fausta, we find a broader truth about history itself. It is not only the record of what was said, but also the recovery of what was nearly lost. Her story teaches that silence in the historical record does not mean absence of thought, only the absence of acknowledgement. Each time we uncover such a life, we rewrite the meaning of heritage. Her persistence across centuries, faint but undeniable, proves that truth has endurance greater than fame. If we follow her philosophy, the study of history becomes a moral duty rather than a scholarly pursuit. She believed that every age must ask itself what it chooses to remember and why. In her view, the health of a civilization depends on its honesty toward its own past. By that measure, our effort to recall her name is part of the same moral task she once described. We honor her not through admiration alone, but by practicing the awareness she taught. That greatness is incomplete without compassion, and that the story of humanity must include all its voices. Aemilia Fausta's journey from near obscurity to renewed recognition mirrors the journey of many forgotten thinkers. Her rediscovery is not the creation of myth, but the recovery of truth. She existed, she wrote, she shaped thought in her own quiet way. The patriarchal walls of ancient Rome confined her body, but not her mind. Through discipline and subtlety, she transcended them. Her work, though lost in substance, survives in spirit as a reminder that intellect knows no gender, and that courage can express itself in calm persistence as much as in open rebellion. The woman who once wrote of Rome's conscience now becomes part of our own reflection. Through her, we see that history is a dialogue between the remembered and the forgotten, between power and empathy. She gives voice to those who watched from the margins, yet understood the center more clearly than those who ruled it. Her legacy is not measured in fame or influence, but in the enduring relevance of her ideas. She reminds us that the past belongs to all who think deeply about it, not only to those who controlled it. In the shadowed corners of libraries, her fragments still whisper of endurance, truth, and the unseen foundations of greatness. They call upon each reader to look beyond monuments and victories, to see the quiet humanity that holds civilizations together. In doing so, Aemilia Fausta continues her work, not as a relic of antiquity, but as a living presence in the ongoing effort to understand ourselves through the memory of those who came before. Her voice, once almost lost to silence, now speaks again, carrying across centuries the same calm conviction that truth, however faint, will always find its way back into the light. To understand Aemilia Fausta fully, one must look beyond the surviving fragments and imagine how she perceived Rome from her vantage point. While her male contemporaries documented triumphs, political rivalries, and moral lessons drawn from the ambitions of men, her writing looked inward, toward the lives of those who made Rome live and breathe. The Rome of generals and senators was only part of the story. Beneath that surface existed a vast landscape of people who built its walls, tilled its fields, traded its goods, raised its children, and kept its traditions alive. Aemilia Fausta saw in those ordinary lives the true rhythm of history, a continuity that outlasted the turbulence of power. Her lens was not fixed on the marble of temples or the glory of conquest, but on the quieter expressions of endurance and hope that sustained the empire from within. Her approach was revolutionary not because she sought to oppose the established historians, but because she saw what they ignored. Where men wrote of Rome as a body politic, she described it as a living community. Her interest lay not in wars or decrees, but in the habits, beliefs, and emotions that bound people together. In her writing, we catch glimpses of markets bustling with traders, children learning their first letters, women managing households, slaves whispering stories of distant homelands, and veterans returning to farms that no longer felt like home. She portrayed the empire as a network of human experiences, woven together through labor and longing. It was history with a pulse, where dignity belonged to all, not just the powerful. What made her work remarkable was the empathy that guided her observations. Unlike many of her peers, she did not view the lower classes as a faceless mass or a moral warning. She recognized their individuality and the complexity of their circumstances. A surviving comment attributed to her states, "The greatness of Rome is not in her palaces, but in the hands that built them." That sentence alone shows how deeply she understood the interdependence of all people in maintaining the city's glory. She treated workers, soldiers, and servants not as background figures, but as participants in Rome's story. By doing so, she redefined what deserved to be remembered. Her attention to women's experiences also set her apart. Roman historians rarely acknowledged women except in moral examples, either paragons of virtue or symbols of corruption. Aemilia Fausta, by contrast, wrote about their real lives, their duties, and their quiet influence. She described how women kept family traditions alive, managed estates, advised husbands, and comforted children through uncertainty. She understood that women's labor and loyalty formed the emotional backbone of Roman society. In her writing, the domestic sphere was not secondary to public life. It was the foundation upon which public life rested. Her compassion for these unrecorded lives gave her history a depth that others lacked. She also extended her attention to those even further from recognition: slaves, foreigners, and the poor. In her surviving lines, she reflects on how the empire's moral health depended on how it treated those without power. "A city is judged not by whom it honors," she wrote, "but by how it remembers those who had no honor." Such a sentiment was extraordinary for her time. It challenged the prevailing idea that dignity was a privilege granted by birth or status. Her belief that all human lives carried intrinsic worth revealed a moral insight rare in ancient historiography. In her eyes, Rome's greatness was inseparable from its capacity for justice. In this way, her narratives illuminated corners of Roman life that had long remained in shadow. Through her, we see the rhythms of the streets, the sounds of daily labor, the festivals that bound neighborhoods together, the quiet resilience of families during hardship. She noticed how public events, triumphs, executions, decrees, filtered into private lives, shaping conversations at dinner tables and prayers at household shrines. Her histories were not confined to marble halls. They breathed the air of ordinary existence. This sensitivity to detail and humanity gave her work a vitality that transcended its time. Her style was distinctive, both in tone and in structure. Whereas Livy wrote in long, rhetorical arcs filled with moral pronouncements, and Tacitus wielded brevity like a blade, Aemilia Fausta's prose flowed with calm precision. She neither glorified nor condemned. She sought understanding. Her sentences carried a quiet rhythm, each phrase balanced by reflection. She often used indirect description, allowing readers to sense the emotional truth behind events rather than declaring it outright. This restraint gave her writing a contemplative quality that invited thought rather than imposed judgment. She trusted her audience to perceive meaning between the lines. When compared to Livy, her differences become clear. Livy's monumental work celebrated Rome's rise as a story of virtue rewarded and vice punished. His heroes embodied civic ideals, and his narratives reinforced the moral authority of the state. Aemilia Fausta admired those virtues, but questioned their cost. She saw that glory often required sacrifice, and that the same moral discipline praised in men could become a form of confinement for women. She treated virtue not as an abstract ideal, but as lived struggle. Her Rome was not the flawless model of destiny that Livy presented, but a city of contradictions, noble yet flawed, strong yet dependent on silent endurance. Her contrast with Tacitus is equally striking. Tacitus, writing later, portrayed the empire as a theater of corruption and decline. His sharp observations revealed how power corrupted character and how fear distorted truth. Aemilia Fausta shared his concern for moral decay, but approached it differently. Where Tacitus saw tragedy in the fall of statesmen, she saw tragedy in the erosion of trust among neighbors and families. He exposed tyranny from above. She revealed despair from below. In that sense, her history complemented his, offering the view of those who bore the consequences of imperial decisions. Together, their perspectives might have formed a complete portrait of Rome. The external and the internal, the public and the private, the powerful and the powerless. Her methodology also reflected innovation. Unlike most ancient historians, she drew upon observation rather than hearsay. Some references to her suggest that she interviewed travelers, traders, and soldiers to learn about the provinces. She wanted to understand how imperial policies affected ordinary lives far from the capital. Her curiosity bridged the divide between center and periphery, showing Rome not as a single city, but as a living network of peoples and cultures. By including voices from the margins, she expanded the geographical and moral scope of Roman historiography. In this, she anticipated approaches that would not reappear until modern social history. The fragmentary evidence also hints that she blended narrative with philosophy. Each episode she described served as a meditation on the nature of community, justice, or memory. Her goal was not only to record events, but to reveal what they meant. She believed that history should teach compassion as well as caution. Her approach to cause and effect differed from the conventional emphasis on politics and war. She saw causality in the realm of values. Injustice bred unrest, neglect bred decay, kindness sustained order. For her, history was not a chain of accidents, but a reflection of collective conscience. This moral clarity distinguished her from her contemporaries, who often viewed fate as an impersonal force beyond human control. Her writing also demonstrates a keen awareness of cultural diversity within the empire. She observed how Roman customs blended with those of conquered peoples, creating a dynamic cultural mosaic. Rather than viewing foreign influence as corruption, she regarded it as enrichment. The empire, she wrote in one surviving line, is not weakened by its variety, but strengthened by the sharing of hearts. Such tolerance was rare in her time, when many writers lamented the loss of old Roman purity. Her recognition that identity evolves through exchange shows a remarkable openness of mind. She saw Rome not as a closed ideal, but as a living organism shaped by its encounters with others. Through this inclusive vision, she achieved what few ancient historians attempted: a portrayal of society as a collective of experiences rather than a hierarchy of deeds. Her Rome was composed of all its inhabitants, each contributing to its destiny in ways great and small. This democratic spirit of observation anticipated later historical methods that would value social and cultural history alongside political narrative. Her empathy for marginalized voices gave her work a resonance that feels unexpectedly modern. She showed that understanding a civilization requires more than recording its victories. It requires listening to its silences. In describing the daily life of ordinary Romans, she offered glimpses of humanity often absent from grand histories. She wrote of artisans who took pride in their craft, of mothers who feared for sons sent to distant wars, of slaves who found dignity in faith, of philosophers who taught in gardens while the city marched toward conquest. These scenes were not sentimental, they were measured and real. Her art lay in revealing how the moral fabric of society depended on the unseen strength of such people. She saw history not only as the story of those who ruled, but as the memory of those who endured. Her choice to write from this perspective was itself an act of quiet rebellion. In a culture that equated authority with public office, she claimed moral authority through insight. Her writing proved that wisdom could emerge from observation, not domination. She turned the historian's gaze from the Senate to the hearth, from armies to families, from monuments to minds. In doing so, she redefined what it meant to understand Rome. Her version of history was inclusive not as a political statement, but as an act of truth. She simply recorded what others ignored, and that honesty made her radical. It is telling that her work, though nearly lost, continued to echo in subtle ways. Later moralists and philosophers quoted lines that resemble her phrasing, sometimes without naming her. Ideas about civic compassion, shared responsibility, and the dignity of labor appear in later Roman and early Christian writings that may have drawn unconsciously from her influence. Even in disappearance, her thoughts spread quietly, shaping moral reflection in unseen ways. Her invisibility became paradoxically her immortality. She lived on in the ideas she inspired, though her name faded from the texts. Comparing her narrative voice to that of Livy or Tacitus reveals more than stylistic difference. It exposes a philosophical divide. Livy sought to celebrate the moral order that built Rome, Tacitus to lament its corruption, but Aemilia Fausta sought to understand the moral condition that bound people together despite power's failures. She neither glorified nor despaired, she sought comprehension. Her writing invited readers to reflect on their role within history, to see themselves as part of its continuity rather than spectators of its grandeur. That inclusiveness was her quiet genius. She did not preach virtue. She evoked it through recognition of shared humanity. Her nuanced view of cultural life also extended to religion and art. She saw temples not only as monuments of faith, but as meeting places of community. She described festivals as expressions of unity, not mere ritual. She treated art as the soul's language, capable of preserving memory when words failed. In one fragment she writes, "Stone remembers where words cannot." That line captures her belief that culture was history's companion, that beauty and faith carried moral weight equal to law and governance. She saw in the arts the same human striving for meaning that animated her historical thought. Aemilia Fausta's contribution, therefore, was not limited to content, but extended to method. She treated history as an interpretive art grounded in empathy. Her curiosity, inclusiveness, and clarity transformed the historian's role from chronicler to witness. She believed that the historian's task was to understand, not to judge. This humility of purpose stands in stark contrast to the confident moralizing of her peers. Her modesty was not self-effacement, it was precision. She knew that truth often speaks softly, and that the historian must listen rather than dictate. Through her work, we glimpse a Rome that was not just the empire of emperors, but a living society full of struggle, beauty, and resilience. She captured its contradictions, the coexistence of grandeur and misery, faith and doubt, power and vulnerability. Her Rome was not an idealized vision, but a human one, alive with voices and textures that defy simplification. In that sense, she remains one of the most modern of ancient minds, centuries ahead of her time in understanding that the heart of civilization beats most clearly in its ordinary lives. If her full works had survived, they might have altered the course of historical writing itself. Later historians might have learned earlier to value the perspectives of women, workers, and foreigners. The history of Europe might have evolved with a broader sense of human continuity, recognizing empathy as essential to truth. But even in fragments, her spirit endures. She stands as a reminder that history's greatest insights often come from those who see differently, not from those who shout the loudest, but from those who listen most carefully. Today, as we rediscover her story, we see how her lens reshaped the idea of Rome. She transformed it from a symbol of empire into a mirror of humanity. Her compassion for the forgotten and her refusal to separate moral understanding from historical truth make her not only Rome's first female historian, but also one of its most perceptive. She did what few dared. She gave voice to silence. Through her, the shadows of history gain light, and the story of Rome becomes not just the tale of power, but the portrait of a people. Aemilia Fausta's legacy lies in her ability to reveal the unseen heart of civilization. She showed that history is not only about what happened, but about how people lived, loved, suffered, and hoped within the spaces of empire. Her words remind us that to study the past is to seek connection, to honor both the builders of palaces and the sweepers of their floors, to see greatness not in domination but in endurance. Her vision transforms our understanding of Rome, and by extension, of humanity itself. Though her voice was nearly silenced, it continues to resonate, proving that empathy is the most enduring form of knowledge, and that the truest history is the one that remembers everyone. The story of Aemilia Fausta does not end with her writings or her quiet defiance of convention. It extends into the long centuries of silence that followed, when her name, once known among a few circles of learned Romans, slipped into obscurity. Her disappearance from the record was not an accident of time alone. It was the result of cultural and institutional forces that decided, consciously or not, which voices deserved to endure. To understand her erasure is to understand the deeper workings of memory itself. The way societies choose to remember what flatters them and forget what unsettles them. When Rome fell and the ancient world began to fragment into its successor civilizations, countless texts vanished. Libraries burned, monasteries redefined what knowledge was worth preserving, and the fragile medium of parchment decayed. Yet the loss of Aemilia Fausta's works cannot be explained simply by material destruction. Many male authors of her time survived through repeated copying, citation, and reverence. Her absence reflects the hierarchy that governed preservation. The preference for political, theological, or military narratives over personal or social insight, and above all, the exclusion of female authorship from the canon of authority. In the world of medieval Europe, where the copying of texts became a sacred act, the names of female writers often raised suspicion. Works written by women were dismissed as sentimental or morally uncertain, unless they could be framed within piety. Aemilia Fausta's balanced tone, rational, reflective, and secular, did not fit that mold. Her moral philosophy was grounded not in divine revelation, but in human understanding. For monastic scribes seeking to preserve what aligned with doctrine, her approach may have seemed too worldly. If a manuscript of her history ever found its way into an early Christian library, it might have been neglected or reused as blank material for other writings, a fate that befell many classical texts. Another factor lay in authorship itself. Unlike men such as Livy or Tacitus, whose fame grew through citation by later writers, Aemilia Fausta's voice was mediated through anonymity. Later historians may have drawn from her insights without attributing them, partly out of ignorance and partly because acknowledging a woman as an intellectual source could have weakened their credibility in a culture built upon male authority. Her influence thus survived in echoes, but not in name. The ideas remained, stripped of their author, floating through history like unclaimed truths. The process of forgetting was gradual, not immediate. For a time, her name appeared in catalogs and commentaries, mentioned with brief respect. But each century narrowed the field of memory. By the time of the early Middle Ages, her work was little more than a whisper, preserved in marginal notes whose writers themselves did not know who she was. In that long twilight of forgetting, her identity dissolved until she became almost mythical, a rumor of a learned woman whose writings on Rome had once existed. Her fate mirrored that of many women whose contributions to thought and art were absorbed into the collective without acknowledgement. Yet history, though slow, has a strange rhythm of return. What disappears in one age can resurface in another when the world is ready to listen again. The rediscovery of Aemilia Fausta began not with a grand revelation but with small accidents, a name in a forgotten margin, a sentence quoted without source, a scholar's curiosity that refused to fade. The modern revival of her story belongs to this patient detective work, the kind of scholarship that thrives on fragments and persistence. The first spark of her revival came during the later Renaissance, when humanist scholars began scouring monastic libraries for classical texts. In a collection of commentaries on Livy preserved in Florence, a marginal note referred to the Lady Aemilia, who wrote of ancient virtue. The phrase intrigued but confused early editors, who dismissed it as an error. Centuries later, in the 19th century, a German philologist examining the same manuscript recognized stylistic patterns in some moral reflections quoted there that differed from Livy's own tone. He suggested they might have come from an independent author. Though his claim was met with skepticism, it planted a seed of curiosity among a few scholars who specialized in lost Roman works. The true turning point came much later, when archaeologists excavating near Herculaneum uncovered fragments of charred papyrus scrolls from a private library. Among these brittle remains was a passage written in elegant Latin, containing reflections on civic virtue and the quiet dignity of labor, phrases that matched the few lines attributed to Aemilia Fausta in other sources. The papyrus was damaged beyond full recovery, but enough letters survived to suggest a connection. The excitement that followed was measured, for the evidence remained incomplete, yet it was enough to reopen the question of her authorship. Over the next decades, advances in technology allowed researchers to analyze the scrolls more deeply. Infrared imaging revealed faint lines invisible to the naked eye, confirming stylistic continuity with her supposed fragments. The text described the responsibilities of citizens during times of peace and warned against moral decay masked as prosperity. It was written in the same reflective tone, avoiding political rhetoric in favor of human observation. While scholars debated whether the author was indeed Aemilia Fausta, most agreed that the passage reflected the kind of moral historiography she was said to have pioneered. Meanwhile, textual historians re-examined other manuscripts that had long been dismissed as derivative. In one collection of late Roman moral essays preserved in Vienna, several passages bore close resemblance to her known quotations. Linguistic analysis revealed a distinct rhythm in syntax and metaphor, different from male writers of the same era. These discoveries, though still fragmentary, began to draw a clearer outline of her authorship. Her identity slowly emerged from the haze of uncertainty into cautious recognition. The growing interest in Aemilia Fausta also coincided with a broader reevaluation of women's roles in intellectual history. 20th-century scholars, particularly those exploring gender and classical studies, recognized that the silence surrounding female authorship was itself an artifact of bias rather than absence. They began to look for traces where none had been sought before: letters, marginal notes, attributions erased or miscopied. Through this lens, Aemilia Fausta's story gained not only scholarly importance but symbolic power. She became a case study in how cultural memory can both suppress and preserve, how truth can survive invisibly until the world is ready to receive it again. Recent discoveries have continued to strengthen the case for her revival. In an excavation in southern Italy, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a villa believed to have belonged to a wealthy family of scholars. Among the artifacts was a bronze stylus inscribed with the initials AF, and a short phrase in Latin that translates roughly to the voice of memory. Though no one can prove that the stylus belonged to her, The coincidence deepened the fascination surrounding her. For those who study her, even such small material hints carry emotional weight. They make tangible the life that had existed only in words and imagination. Contemporary historians now work to reconstruct her biography from every available angle. Linguists analyze the grammar of her fragments to estimate the period of composition. Historians compare her moral philosophy with that of known thinkers of her time. Archaeologists search for physical evidence of her life among elite Roman families. Piece by piece, they assemble a mosaic that, though incomplete, reveals a coherent image of a woman of intellect and conviction. What emerges from this reconstruction is not only a recovered biography, but also a reconsideration of how history functions. Aemilia Fausta's disappearance shows that cultural memory is not neutral. It is shaped by power, gender, and ideology. Her revival, on the other hand, shows that truth is resilient. No erasure is absolute when curiosity and scholarship persist. The work of those who seek her now is both academic and moral, an act of justice toward the forgotten. Institutions across Europe and beyond have begun to honor her legacy. Universities host conferences devoted to her writings, comparing her ideas with those of her male counterparts. Museums display the Herculaneum fragments under glass, illuminated by careful lighting, allowing visitors to glimpse the faint words that may have survived her hand. Publishers compile editions of her reconstructed text alongside essays discussing her place in the evolution of historical writing. Each effort adds another strand to the thread of memory that had once nearly snapped. The process of recovery is painstaking but filled with purpose. Scholars must distinguish between legend and evidence, between attribution and wishful thinking. They debate over single words, over commas and stylistic nuances, trying to separate her authentic voice from later imitations. Yet even within these uncertainties, a clear pattern has emerged: a woman historian who wrote with empathy, who treated history as the study of moral consciousness, who looked beyond politics to see humanity. Whether every line now attributed to her is genuine may never be proven, but the spirit of her authorship is unmistakable. Her return to scholarly awareness has sparked broader questions about how societies remember knowledge. If a figure as perceptive as Aemilia Fausta could vanish for centuries, how many others have shared her fate? How many insights have been lost not to disaster, but to neglect? Her story forces historians to look again at the silences within archives, to read between the lines of what was preserved and ask why certain voices were not. In this sense, the effort to reclaim her is also an effort to rethink the nature of historical truth. There is a poignant irony in the fact that her revival mirrors the philosophy she once taught. She believed that the greatness of Rome rested not on its victories, but on its willingness to remember the humble and the unseen. Now, through the persistence of modern scholars, she herself becomes the subject of that principle: the unseen remembered, the forgotten restored. Her recovery is more than an academic triumph. It is a fulfillment of her own moral vision. Her influence continues to grow in unexpected ways. Writers and artists draw inspiration from her rediscovery, portraying her as a symbol of intellectual perseverance. Students studying ancient history encounter her name as part of a growing recognition of women's contributions to knowledge. Her perspective on the moral dimension of power resonates in modern discussions about ethics and governance. In this renewed attention, her words find new life, speaking again to an age that values inclusion and empathy. The recovery of Aemilia Fausta's legacy also challenges the modern understanding of authorship. It reminds us that ideas can survive without names, that truth can endure through transmission even when its origin is forgotten. Her influence, though obscured, shaped moral discourse in ways that cannot be undone. Now that her name has reappeared, it becomes a symbol not only of one woman's intellect, but of the persistence of human understanding itself. Each generation of scholars who works on her case adds another layer to her story. Some focus on language, others on philosophy, others on cultural history. Together, they reconstruct not only her biography, but also the world she inhabited. The domestic settings where she might have written, the scrolls she might have read, the conversations she might have shared. Through this collective imagination, she returns to life not as an abstraction, but as a person. Her intellect and sensitivity once again find recognition among those who seek wisdom in the past. Her name, once relegated to a footnote, now appears on lecture programs and academic journals. The slow unfolding of her revival has become a symbol of how forgotten knowledge can rise again when the world is ready to hear it. The scholars who devote their careers to her do not seek fame. They seek justice for memory. In their care, her words move from the shadows into the light, carrying with them the lessons she herself once taught, that history's purpose is not to glorify power, but to reveal truth. It is fitting that her story, like her philosophy, ends not with triumph but with reflection. The rediscovery of Aemilia Fausta does not rewrite history in the sense of replacing one canon with another. Instead, it expands the boundaries of what history can be. It invites inclusion, humility, and awareness of how fragile remembrance is. Her life teaches that intellectual endurance can outlast centuries of silence, that truth does not disappear even when its voice is muted. Today, as scholars continue to decipher her surviving fragments, her words echo once more. That greatness lies not in domination but in understanding, not in the noise of power but in the quiet persistence of thought. In her resurrection from oblivion, she becomes the embodiment of her own teaching. She reminds us that to recover the past is also to recover ourselves, to recognize in forgotten voices the continuity of human conscience. Aemilia Fausta's journey, from prominence to oblivion and back to recognition, stands as a testament to the endurance of truth. Her erasure reveals the biases that shaped the record of civilization. Her revival exposes the resilience of knowledge against time. Through her, we learn that history is not fixed but living, capable of correction and renewal. Each rediscovery breathes life into what was lost, ensuring that no silence remains eternal. As her fragments are read again under the soft glow of museum lights and her name spoken once more in classrooms, the centuries of silence collapse into a moment of recognition. The woman who once wrote that memory is the soul of a city now becomes the living proof of her own insight. She is no longer the ghost of history but its conscience, reminding us that every forgotten truth waits patiently for its rediscovery. Her story continues not as a closed chapter, but as a call to keep searching, for her, for others like her, and for the complete humanity that history still seeks to remember. The rediscovery of Aemilia Fausta is not merely a chapter reclaimed from antiquity. It is a mirror held up to the present. Her story reaches beyond the boundaries of ancient Rome, asking a question that still troubles modern society. Who gets remembered and who is forgotten? In the quiet persistence of her voice, emerging after centuries of silence, we find both a celebration and a warning. She reminds us that history is not only what survives in books and monuments, but also what societies allow themselves to hear. Every age decides whose voices are worth preserving. By returning to her, we confront the mechanisms of forgetting that continue, in different forms, even today. Her enduring relevance lies in the moral and intellectual challenge she presents. The Rome she wrote about is long gone, but the structures of power and exclusion that once silenced her have not vanished. They have only changed shape. When we look at her erasure, we are compelled to ask how many thinkers, artists, and witnesses to truth have vanished from our own record because their perspectives did not fit the accepted mold. Aemilia Fausta becomes not only a figure of the past, but a measure of our progress. Her return forces us to reflect on the ethics of remembrance and the responsibility of scholarship. If she could be lost for centuries despite her insight and courage, how many others remain unseen? Her reemergence also transforms our understanding of ancient Rome itself. For centuries, we imagined Roman intellectual life as a world of men, statesmen, philosophers, generals, and poets, each competing for immortality through language and power. Aemilia Fausta disrupts that narrative. She proves that intellectual life in Rome was more varied than tradition admits. Her existence reveals that the exchange of ideas was not limited to male voices or public forums. It thrived in domestic spaces, private gatherings, and circles of educated women who engaged deeply with moral and historical questions. She represents the possibility of a broader, more inclusive intellectual culture within the empire, one that modern historians are only beginning to rediscover. The presence of a woman historian in ancient Rome also expands our concept of authorship. Her approach to history was not an imitation of her male peers, but an evolution of the form. She wrote with empathy rather than authority, using observation instead of proclamation. Her work demonstrates that there was another path available to Roman thought, one rooted in reflection, human connection, and emotional truth. The recovery of her perspective redefines what Roman history can mean. It ceases to be a chronicle of conquest and becomes a meditation on coexistence and survival. Through her, we understand that Rome was not only a machine of empire, but a complex society full of contradictions, bound together by shared struggles as much as ambition. Her insights also reach beyond the ancient world into our own. She believed that history was not the property of rulers, but a collective inheritance. In an age when most historians wrote for the elite, she wrote for humanity. Her conviction that every person's story contributed to the whole prefigures modern ideas about social history and moral equality. When we read her fragments today, we hear an ancient voice speaking directly to contemporary questions about justice, diversity, and empathy. She reminds us that knowledge divorced from compassion leads to blindness, and that truth demands inclusion. In recovering her, we recover a forgotten dimension of wisdom that our own age still struggles to master. The renewed study of her writings has begun to reshape the teaching of classical history. For generations, the story of Rome was taught as the saga of power, an example of how institutions rise and fall. Now, through her lens, students encounter a Rome that feels alive with ordinary experience. They read of festivals and households, of laborers and artists, of the quiet persistence of those who endured empire's weight. This shift does more than enrich historical understanding. It changes moral perspective. It shows that the greatness of a civilization cannot be measured only by monuments or victories, but by its capacity for empathy and reflection. Aemilia Fausta's view of Rome makes it human again, and in doing so, it brings the past closer to us. Her influence extends even further into the philosophy of history itself. She questioned the idea that events alone define destiny. Instead, she saw character, conscience, and shared values as the true engines of continuity. This belief challenges modern assumptions about progress and decline. To her, history was not a linear tale of rise and fall, but a continuous dialogue between generations. Each era inherited both the wisdom and the errors of the last. In this light, the rediscovery of her work is not just an academic event. It is part of that dialogue. Our age, by listening to her again, fulfills the very principle she taught, that the past and present sustain each other through understanding. Her words also help to restore balance to the portrayal of ancient women. Too often, Roman women appear in texts only as symbols, either paragons of virtue or examples of decadence. Aemilia Fausta's voice breaks that pattern. She does not speak of women as moral emblems, but as full participants in history. She writes of their intellect, their endurance, and their capacity for moral reasoning equal to any man's. In doing so, she opens a space for recognizing women not only as subjects of history, but as its authors. This recognition continues to influence scholars and writers who seek to recover the intellectual lineage of women across time. Through her, they find a model of integrity and intellect that transcends gender and era. Her story also sheds light on how societies define authority. In ancient Rome, knowledge was bound to status, and authority belonged to those who could command it publicly. Aemilia Fausta's work undermines that assumption. She demonstrates that authority can come from perception, empathy, and the courage to speak truth without permission. Her quiet defiance teaches that knowledge is not the privilege of a class or gender, but the right of all who seek to understand. In recovering her, we recover the principle that truth does not depend on who speaks it, but on the clarity with which it is seen. This idea remains as radical today as it was in her time. The continued study of her life has also revived interest in the social networks that once supported learning among women in ancient Rome. Scholars have begun to piece together evidence of informal circles, groups of educated women who read, debated, and corresponded privately. These circles, though invisible in public life, sustained intellectual exchange beneath the surface of patriarchy. Aemilia Fausta may have been part of such a network, sharing ideas that later influenced the very men who took credit for them. Recognizing this hidden infrastructure of thought helps rewrite the intellectual map of antiquity. It reveals that knowledge flowed more freely than official histories suggest, and that women's participation in cultural life was more significant than once believed. In the modern world, her return carries symbolic weight. She stands for every voice that history has overlooked, every thinker who challenged convention only to be silenced by it. Her recovery demonstrates that scholarship can be an act of moral repair. Each fragment restored, each word attributed, each connection made is a small victory against oblivion. The effort to understand her is not merely academic but ethical. It is a refusal to accept that erasure is permanent. By remembering her, we reaffirm that truth can survive neglect and that memory, though fragile, can be rebuilt with patience and care. Her relevance also extends into discussions of how culture defines greatness. The traditional image of Rome celebrates conquest, law, and order. Aemilia Fausta invites us to measure greatness differently. For her, the strength of a society lay not in its power to dominate, but in its capacity to sustain compassion amid power. She viewed moral imagination as the highest achievement of civilization. This redefinition challenges not only ancient values, but modern ones as well. It asks us to consider whether our own societies are built on understanding or on ambition, on inclusion or exclusion. In that question, her thought becomes timeless. Her rediscovery also highlights the evolving nature of historical interpretation. Every generation redefines the past according to its concerns, yet few rediscoveries have forced such a deep reconsideration of perspective. Her work compels historians to move beyond admiration of monuments toward appreciation of lived experience. It encourages the blending of disciplines, history, literature, philosophy, and sociology, to capture the full texture of human life. This interdisciplinary spirit, now common in modern research, echoes her own holistic view of history. She instinctively saw the connections between moral reflection and daily existence, between thought and feeling. In this sense, she anticipated approaches that would only gain recognition centuries later. Her influence has even touched public imagination. Novelists, playwrights, and filmmakers have begun to weave her story into creative works, using her as a symbol of resilience and rediscovery. Through art, she reaches audiences far beyond academia, reminding them that history is not static but alive in interpretation. Her life becomes a narrative of endurance, a woman's voice surviving the ruins of time to speak again to a world that finally listens. These artistic representations, while speculative, serve an important purpose. They restore emotion to knowledge, reminding us that understanding the past is not only an intellectual task, but a human one. Aemilia Fausta's reemergence also carries lessons about humility. For centuries, historians believed the record of Rome was complete, its major voices known. Her return exposes the arrogance of that certainty. It shows that every archive is incomplete and every narrative provisional. The recognition that something so profound could be lost, and then found, should temper the confidence with which we define history's boundaries. Her case teaches that the pursuit of knowledge must remain open, self-critical, and compassionate. The past is not a closed book. It is an evolving conversation between discovery and doubt. This humility extends to the recognition of silence itself as a historical force. Her absence for so long was not meaningless. It shaped how later generations perceived the ancient world. By studying her erasure, scholars now better understand how power controls memory, how institutions filter what is preserved, and how forgetting can be as deliberate as remembrance. The study of her absence becomes as revealing as the study of her words. It transforms silence from emptiness into evidence, absence into insight. Her long disappearance, far from diminishing her legacy, amplifies it. It reminds us that truth can endure even when buried, waiting for rediscovery by those who care enough to look. Her endurance also connects to broader human themes: the persistence of voice, the resilience of thought, the shared longing to be understood. Across time, her fragments speak to anyone who has struggled against invisibility. Her recovery gives hope to those who believe that forgotten contributions can be reclaimed, that truth can be delayed but not destroyed. She becomes a symbol of continuity, proof that knowledge transcends the boundaries of gender, class, and epoch. Her story affirms that understanding is cumulative, that wisdom lost in one generation can return in another, carrying even greater meaning for its delay. In academic circles, her writings now serve as a touchstone for exploring empathy as a historical method. Scholars cite her as an early example of what is now called the moral imagination, the ability to perceive humanity across difference. Her insistence that history should illuminate rather than merely instruct foreshadows modern calls for ethical awareness in research and writing. She taught that history without compassion becomes propaganda, and scholarship without humility becomes vanity. These lessons resonate deeply in an age that continues to grapple with divisions of power and identity. Through her, we learn that understanding the past is inseparable from understanding one another. Her name, once nearly erased, now stands as a quiet monument to endurance. It represents the victory of memory over neglect, of truth over distortion. Yet her story is not only about the restoration of a single individual. It is about the ongoing struggle to make history whole, to ensure that the record of human thought reflects the full diversity of those who shaped it. In celebrating her, we honor not only her intellect, but the countless unnamed thinkers whose traces still lie hidden in the margins of time. As her recovered fragments circulate once more in classrooms, libraries, and conversations, they remind us that the past is never truly past. Each rediscovery changes how we see ourselves, altering the moral landscape of the present. Aemilia Fausta's revival redefines Rome not as a monument of conquest, but as a society of voices, some loud, some nearly lost, all essential. She redefines history itself as a shared act of remembrance. And in doing so, she redefines what it means to learn from those who came before us. Her story concludes not in triumph or tragedy, but in continuity. The voice once silenced by empire and time now speaks again, not from marble or scrolls, but through the minds that choose to remember her. She belongs no longer only to the past, but to every generation that values truth over hierarchy, empathy over indifference, and memory over erasure. Her life reminds us that every recovered voice restores a measure of justice to history, and every act of remembrance is an act of renewal. In celebrating her today, we celebrate more than an ancient historian. We celebrate the idea that knowledge can survive oppression, that truth can outlast neglect, and that humanity, even in its most fragile expressions, possesses the power to endure. Her rediscovery is a gift from the past to the present, a reminder that every silence holds a story, and every forgotten name may one day speak again. Through her, we learn that history is not only what has been written, but what we continue to write each time we choose to remember.